Hey, Justin.
Hey Kyle, how are you?
Oh, good. I'm good. Yeah, I'm so excited to talk today. Specifically, to talk about the election that's upcoming, to talk a little bit about the GDP numbers, to talk about the economic data that we've gotten over the past few days. We're going into obviously a very important election, and we got this GDP print yesterday that told us a little bit about the state of the economy. GDP did come in at 2.8% during the third quarter, which is the 10th straight quarter of growth. How do you react to this data, and what do you think it says about the state of the US economy going into the election?
I'd say, crikey, that's fantastic. There are one of the ways in which I can sound a little bit more like a professor is I always take one step back relative to someone in the markets. So they might be saying 2.8% versus consensus, which was a couple of tenths higher. Sure. But let's go back. 2.8%, that's higher than our long run average growth rate. It's higher than you would expect at this relatively late stage of the expansion. If you went back a year ago and look at the survey of professional forecasters, they were predicting 1.3% for this quarter, and many were predicting a recession. So output is higher than CBO had imagined it would be before the pandemic. So we had this big major thing, and we somehow ended up better than people thought we were before they realized we were going to have to live through COVID. And the economy keeps growing, and inflation is low and falling, and unemployment is very low. Crikey, what's not to like, mate?
And a lot of people are, of course, concerned about the various economic agendas of the two candidates. But I first want to get a little bit deeper into GDP. There's, of course, always pushback about GDP as an accurate measurement for the economy. Some people say, a lot of spending is driven by wealthier consumers. Like when we look at GDP as a measure of economic success, considering the narratives that we might be hearing and the lived experiences that people have, how do you think about GDP in light of the perhaps impact of wealthier people and as maybe a questionable metric? How would you respond to that?
So I am not GDP's biggest fan by any means. I think it's a terrible way to communicate to the broader public. They care about things like jobs, spending power, even simpler words like income. Now, of course, GDP is a measure of income. So why don't we just call it income? So I don't think it's a great way of communicating. The way it's constructed is to meet this sort of internally consistent way of thinking about total output in the economy. It's not constructed to give the best single index for where the economy is and where it's heading. It includes lots of noisy factors, for instance, like inventories bounce up and down like crazy and don't have much to do with underlying growth, but can bounce around the GDP statistics an enormous amount. So GDP just is what it is. It's how we measure output. It's not the measure of the state of the business cycle I would particularly emphasize, and it's not one that communicates clearly with people. At the present moment, though, it's roughly consistent with other indicators, which is the economy is growing strongly, the real economy. We're seeing that pretty much across the board. Kylie, you raise an important point, which is macroeconomists should talk about distribution, how the pie is getting sliced and not just how much bigger it is. GDP is how big the pie is. We don't know a lot about distribution. Now, what we do know is that this expansion is the first economic expansion in my professional career in which it appears that inequality is falling. Wages for folks at the low wage end of the distribution have seen much larger real wage gains than those at the high end of the distribution. A fun fact is if you look at the point of the wage distribution where market participants and journalists are, they're the folks who've seen not much by way of real wage gains. But if you look at where people are, you see much larger real wage gains. So, look, the history of inequality through the 2020s is yet to be written. Our inequality data is even worse and even rarer and even less reliable than our GDP data. But so far what I've seen is this has been a rising tide that has really not only lifted all boats, but really those that needed it.
And when we think about the policy proposals that the candidates are talking about, there's a lot of concerns about specifically Trump's policy, around tariffs. And I know you've done a lot of work responding to the vice president online. But what is the biggest concern that you see with Trump's policy as well as Harris's policy?
Do you mean on tariffs or taxes more generally, or economics
Just more generally, when you think about the two candidates and the economic policies that they've proposed, like Trump, tariffs are probably the most concerning point. But I think, number one, people might not be aware of Harris's economic policy proposals. But then number two, do you see any big concerns with what she's talking about as well? So a double-barreled question.
Okay, so let me give 2 barrels of an answer. Let's start on taxes. The reason I want to start on taxes is because the ways in which a president affects the macroeconomy are not obvious. And they're very diffuse, and they're affected by a lot of other things, world conditions, pandemics, oil prices, wars, and so on. So each side could promise you a bigger pie, but really neither can promise to deliver. What taxes do is they really do affect, for anyone who's watching right now, your after-tax income. That's a lever that goes straight from the White House to your pocketbook. So what Trump is doing, it takes a while to figure out what's going on. And once I did, I was like, oh man, that's sneaky. So here's what it is. It's a income tax for tariff swap. And you might be thinking, why would a center-right politician or a right-right politician want that? Well, the income tax cuts are really aimed at the high end of the income distribution. Very large declines in tax rates for the wealthy, but declines throughout the distribution. But we're going to pay for that with tariffs. Tariffs are kind of like a sales tax, but just on a random 1/3 of the stuff we buy, the stuff that's imported. As a result, it ends up acting exactly like a flat tax. The thing is, poor people spend money as a share of their income, at least as much as rich people do. And so a tariff is actually among the most regressive taxes you could possibly imagine. So the net effect is we're going to pay for tax cuts, which mostly go to the rich, by taxing everyone, particularly the working and middle classes. And the net result is, if you do the math, it may well be that Trump reduces total tax revenues, but actually raises the taxes that he gets from 95% of Americans, the poorest 95%. The richest 5%, well, they're going to pay a little bit more for their French champagne, but that's not such a big share of their income anyway. And they're going to get these huge tax rises. So it's likely the case, and we can quibble at precise numbers, but basically the large majority of the American public gets a tax hike under Trump, once you count tariffs as what they are as a tax. You can actually flip that around. Let's do the distributional analysis for Harris. It turns out that Harris is offering a tax cut to 95% of people and a tax hike to 5%. You can guess which 5% they are. It's the wealthy. So these policies are, in fact, a direct mirror image of each other. It's about whether you want to help 5 versus 95. What I think is so sneaky is the rhetoric around the Trump tax plan is tariffs, because tariffs are going to help the working class by bringing jobs back to America. Even if that were true, I don't believe it is. It's all being paid for by the working class. And so this is the sneakiest, cleverest packaging of a redistribution from the working class to the rich I've seen in my lifetime.
Yeah. And it's, I think it's the one thing that all economists might agree on, which is tariffs are maybe not the most effective, at least flat, like blanket tariffs are not the most effective economic tool.
Right. Notice everything I just said is before getting to the question, are they dumb? I didn't even say the pie got smaller, right?
Yeah.
I said this is a way of taxing people so that the slices of the pie that most people get are smaller. Then there's the standard economic analysis. And the standard economic analysis is you're going to shrink the pie. And then the real trap we all fell into, because we economists think it's fascinating, and I do, I just taught it to my 101 students. It's fascinating to think that allowing imports into America makes Americans better off. That's very counterintuitive. We love counterintuitive ideas, we economists. And so we spend all this time trying to convince people at that point. We don't need to. Because the reality is if we start a tariff war, trade war is going to come straight back at us. And so American exporters are going to face high tariffs as well. So the reality is the real policy debate is between Harris, who proposes no trade war, and Trump, who proposes a trade war. Now, there may be economists who think tariffs are a good idea. There's not a single economist on earth who thinks a trade war in which we don't buy stuff from abroad and they don't buy stuff from us makes either or both sides better off. So, the distributional things are before we get there. Now, Kyla, the one thing I didn't come back and answer is what is the biggest or most important issue in this election? I don't know if you still want us to talk about that, because I don't think it's tariffs.
What do you think it is?
That was a dramatic pause.
I know. I was just thinking.
Let's let the tension build.
Yeah. I thought you were going to answer it. Okay. So what do you think?
I will go ahead. I was waiting to be invited. So the truth is, when we look at the ups and downs of the American business cycle, the difference between a recession and a boom, we're talking about a handful of percentage points. GDP's a few percent higher, a few percent lower. It's not that big. When you look around the world and you compare average incomes, which we economists call GDP per capita, the differences between rich countries and poor countries are enormous, right? How much richer is the United States, for instance, than Argentina, or the country I was born in, Papua New Guinea, right? And then there's a whole industry of economists, including several who won the Nobel Prize this year, who try and explain what causes those differences across countries. And the answer seems to be what you need is a functional set of institutions. Those institutions which lead politicians to make decisions that are in the best interests of people and help the economy grow. And so we need institutions that lead politicians to make choices that expand the pie rather than snatching it all for themselves. One of the most important of those institutions is democracy. Respect for the rule of law, things like this. And so this is where Argentina is quite instructive. You go back 100 years, and Argentina and the United States were two of the richest countries in the world. And what subsequently happened is Argentina lost those institutions. It had tremendous political turmoil. It lost democracy. It lost respect for the rule of law. It shut itself off from the rest of the world. And Argentina today is poor while the United States is rich. I'm not for a moment predicting the United States is about to become Argentina, but I'm pointing out that the levers that matter the most for the state of an economy are not the stuff we normally talk about of interest rates and tariffs and government spending and so on. It's the deep institutions. And we have an amazing set of political and economic institutions in the United States. That's what's delivered the tremendous economic growth that we've enjoyed here. And one of the two candidates, Trump, is a threat to those institutions. The idea of not accepting the will of the people is not only traumatic, it's dramatic. The idea then that he is going to be in charge of who pays high tariffs and low tariffs, and suddenly in Russia we call them the oligarchs, in the United States we call them the billionaires, start having to worry about what one man thinks of them. They start running their businesses with a view to what one man watching Fox News is thinking rather than what maximizes profits. And so that is what worries me enormously. So I would say anytime either side of politics throws up a candidate that threatens fundamental American institutions, that's the candidate I'm going to vote against. And so for the first time in my life, I think we have one of those candidates. And whether I'm from the left or the right, I think it would be a very, very bad idea to risk the things that have made us wealthy.
And why do you think people are willing to risk it? Like, there's a lot of economic discontent. There's a lot of people who are extraordinarily angry. The cost of living is very high. Like, how do you square all of that with what's happening at the political level?
Yeah, so why are people willing to vote for an anti-democratic populist who is arguably going to implement policies against their best interest? First, there are many books that have been written on this, and I don't have a lot to add. But yeah, I think the simple version is they're pissed. Trump is the nearest middle finger you can send to Washington. That makes some amount of sense, but it doesn't give you everything, right? I can be pissed and still have self-preservation. And then so I think your question is, why don't they want to preserve what's useful and what's good? There were Reagan Democrats. Reagan was conservative, fundamentally conservative. Trump is the opposite of conservative. He's radical. So it probably is no surprise that this might happen in a moment in American history where none of us remember times when our fundamental institutions have been under threat. You and I have grown up always believing there'll be another election in 4 years, always believing the rule of law will be enforced, always believing contracts will be honoured. That wasn't true of earlier generations who were alive during the Cold War, who've seen World War I and II, who've seen all sorts of political tumult all around the world. And when we talk to our friends, and this is an observation for your viewers, talk to your friends who are from other countries that have not enjoyed the degree of political stability that we have, and ask them what it's like. Because I think too many of us have forgotten that actually there would be nothing I want more for the next presidency than to be boring. And that's an incredibly conservative thing to say. But when you got it pretty good, you don't want to roll the dice.
No. And I think it ultimately ends up being so distracting for the American public, and so tiring. Like, I think a lot of people are just quite exhausted. And yeah, there have been a lot of books written about, what happens when populism takes hold. And we're kind of seeing it at a global level too, which is interesting. A lot of far-right movements. And when we think about the economic issues that people are upset about, is there a way to address them? I'm sure there is, in a democratic way.
I think you're engaged in one of the most noble enterprises one can be involved in at this moment in time, which is educating people about how their world works. This is not a liberal coming on and saying the problem is that the punters are stupid. They're not stupid. They're pissed, and they've got lots of reasons to be pissed. But we're also neither side of politics is being honest with them about the trade-offs that exist. You and I understand many of those trade-offs, and the knowledge of economics is tentative and imperfect. I totally accept. But I think speaking plainly about how the world works, it's what I do as an Econ 101 teacher, and it's what you're doing with this podcast. There are probably more noble things to do, but I think this one's a pretty good one.
Yeah. And so really it's just doing it at a ground roots level. But like when we think about policy, right, like cost of living, like what are some policies that can be passed to fix, the grocery bill?
There are short-run answers and long-run answers. And the short-run answers, I think, are Band-Aids and not very interesting and sometimes even unhelpful. The longer-run answers are, what is it that grows living standards in the United States? And it's having a good set of institutions, and those institutions in turn leading people to invest in their own education or to start new, and also invest in starting new businesses. And we have many of the world's great tech companies. Those are the long run determinants of economic growth. And if we keep our eye on that, rather than being distracted by the politics of resentment, and I think that's what really lies behind tariffs, I'm a grow the pie guy. And yeah, I sometimes get pissed off that a billionaire is getting an extra $1 billion while people I think are more deserving don't. But we want, and I think it's good for the long run political stability of the United States, an inclusive form of capitalism. Part of the reason the punters get pissed is because they understand that they're getting screwed. And so let's grow the pie, but let's do it in a way where everyone shares.
Yeah. And what are some policy recommendations there?
Okay. So, the start of pro-growth policy is going to be rest on two pillars, I think: education and innovation. There are some complaints at the margin about regulation getting in the way of innovation. Sort of sympathetic to it, although it's obviously not been a big deal when it comes to companies like OpenAI, who I think have been able to innovate quite freely. That brings into it, you want an appropriate market structure. So companies are competing rather than merging. Competition is what forces the next new idea to come out and forces the investment in new ideas if I can just merge with any startup that might potentially eat my lunch, that's one less reason for me to innovate. And then, so what we want is growth subject to a political constraint. The political constraint is people feel like they're included. And so this is where we really do have some really grotesque parts to our economy. Think of the carried interest loophole. Rich people can get richer and richer and make a lot of money and then die and give all that money to their kids. And every dollar I made in my lifetime, I paid tax on. But these guys don't pay tax. There's no economic rationale for the carried interest loophole. It's pure lobbying. Of course, people get pissed. People get pissed when they discover that they paid more in taxes than Trump did last year. Why does stuff like that happen? We have an underfunded IRS. I think it's utterly grotesque that the congressional Republicans decided to defund the tax police, effectively delivering a tax cut to those I think of as being the least deserving in our society, which is tax cheats. I would rather give a tax cut to anyone else. And so I think some of these things, look, the actual economics of them may not be that central, but the politics is, which is, leaders should lead and they should show that we're interested in setting rules of the game that give everyone a chance. And every time Congress passes one of these lobbied for bills that helps one group only because of the amount of lobbying they've been doing and does so in such an unfair way, they undermine the public's trust in capitalism.
Yeah. I think that's definitely what you hear a lot of is like the billionaires are taking over, and you kind of see that action playing out where some might be making decisions based on the potential outcome of the election. And, corporations are buying up all the homes. That's a common thing that people say. But my last question for you is sort of out of left field, but a lot of economists do tend to seem left. They lean left in policy. Maybe they lean left in commentary. How do you think about that? And why do you think that is?
Yeah. So,
and do you agree with that?
Let's start with
that's
the premise.
probably,
yeah, I was going to start with the premise, which is if you were talking about academic economists, if you go onto a university campus and you walked into every department on campus and you asked people how they voted, the most right-wing field would be economics. You could also say the most centrist field would be economics. So conditional, if what you're doing is going for your representatives of economics only going onto campuses, well, it turns out in any field, if you walk onto campus, you're going left, right? These are just happy places to be slightly left. Yeah. If you and I walk down Wall Street talking to economics PhDs, they're not so left-wing. In fact, I'd say they're rough. My experience is roughly 50-50. If you walk through the Trump White House, well, you wouldn't discover any economics PhDs. That would be the problem. So I don't think the field is overwhelmingly left-wing. I do think academic economics, you're probably right. The median academic economist will vote Democratic in this election. If you wanted to test the politics of academic economists, it would be great if the Republican Party would put up Mitt Romney who did get quite substantial support among academic economists rather than Donald Trump. So here, I have many friends who've served in who've served in the Bush administration who said they didn't leave the Republican Party left them. And you think of people like Greg Mankiw and Ben Bernanke, really wonderful, wonderful economists who do have center-right views, do not have a home in the Republican Party. Now, I know those guys and I know their politics. The problem there is the Republican Party, not them.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Justin. Is there anything else? Yeah.
You asked one good question. Let me just take one more thing on it. I actually have I have several jobs. One of them is I speak to the public, and you probably kind of hear my views on politics a little bit, right? You can probably guess which way I'm going to vote on Tuesday. I have a different job, which is I teach Economics 101. And I have written an economics textbook that's used all across the country.
It's very good.
There, Wonderful. I'm glad you said that. But what I want you to do, Kyla, is I want you to open up any page that you think is controversial in left-right terms, the minimum wage, inequality, and so on, and read it and tell me if you can tell whether it was written by a Democrat or a Republican. And I'm going to bet you can't tell. And that's because actually for a large part of my job, the teaching part where I have young minds that I'm trying to mold, the idea that I'm trying to represent the field of economics rather than the left or the right is a much more important form of identity to me. I'm an economist a long, long, long time before I'm either left or right. In an election season, asking why are so many left, sure, that's fair game. But I think by the time we get to an odd-numbered year, we'll be back to talking about regressions and standard errors and problems with models and all sorts of things that can bore you.
Yeah, it is interesting how ideology becomes center stage during an election. Like it's almost like everybody wants to know what color shirt you're going to wear, and it's I think it's so distracting. Like I said, and obviously this podcast is not about my big opinions, but I think that there is so much more value to talking about raw economic data, but all of that is polluted right now, by these by tribalism in a really big way, and it's very difficult to navigate. And I'm very appreciative that you go on the news and help educate and that you're molding the young minds, because we need it.
Yeah, and we all get a little dumber in election season. So I look forward, Kyla, to next time you and I speak. We're both going to be a little smarter, and hopefully so are you viewers.
Not so tired. Yeah, that sounds great, Justin. Thank you.
All right, take care.